Welcome to the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the Canoa Legacy Talk that is a collaboration between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation of knowledge about New Mexico, the greater Southwest as a region, its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and Spain. The Canoa Legacy Talks take their inspiration from the very word Canoa, which can have several meanings. Here at the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, we have a more modern rendition, an artistic rendition of Canoa, which you can see to my right. The piece here reminds us, el agua es vida. We also want our talks to create knowledge, inspire action, bring practical and useful information to community members, specialized researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, sociology, politics, and religious experience of our region.
Chris is a venerable and formidable scholar. He is professor of cultural landscape studies at the University of New Mexico School of Architecture and Planning. He is the J.B. Jackson Chair of Cultural Landscape Studies and a former and founding director of UNM's Historical Preservation and Regionalism program. He served as president of the Vernacular Architectural Forum. He has written and co-written or edited a number of books with titles like Drawn to the Landscape, The Plazas of New Mexico, and Place Over Time. There are a whole lot more, and I can't list them all now. The Myth of Santa Fe is a particular favorite of mine. It influenced me when I was a 20-something, and reading it back, and it remains and it is today required reading for our students at the University of New Mexico. Another one that means a great deal to me is called La Tierra Maria. It's History, Architecture, and Landscape. That's a book that's even earlier. That's from, 1990, 91? And I've seen people who live in that landscape and who are from that landscape read and enjoy this book. It means a great deal to the people who live there in La Tierra Maria to read these stories and this information about their homes. So right now, and I'm glad that there's been such a tremendous turnout, please now join UNM Center for Regional Studies and the National Hispanic Cultural Center in welcoming the venerable and formidable Dr. Wilson.
Well, Michael, thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a chill but beautiful Saturday afternoon. And thanks to the National Hispanic Culture Center and the Center for Regional Studies at UNM for sponsoring the series and inviting me. It's really an honor to speak in the Canoa series. We live in polarized, partisan, politically perilous times. We have a president who thinks in us-them terms and spends an awful lot of time Sorry?
Not so close.
Oh, sorry.
Not so close.
Not so close.
And spends a lot of time demonizing them, which at this point means pretty much all of us. But it's also the time of Black Lives Matter and of an anti-police brutality movement here. We're grappling with politics and justice in a way that I think we maybe haven't since the 1960s and into the early 1970s, with the civil rights movement, the Chicano, Red Power movements, women's and gay rights movements catalyzing at that time. We're taking down Confederate monuments in the South. And at UNM, we're debating what to do with the murals in Zimmerman Library, which have, a legacy embedded in them that's, very much open to debate. And so what I'd like to do this afternoon is try to make a contribution to these debates, especially as they take place here in New Mexico, by giving some historical context to the development of New Mexico's ideology of tri-culturalism. Where did it come from? What are its constituents? What are some of the meanings that we can unpack from them? New Mexico's public ideology of tri-culturalism holds that the state consists of three separate ethnic groups living together in harmony, be they Pueblo Indians, Mexicans, and Americans, the terms first used in the 1880s, or Native Americans, Hispanics, and Anglos, the terms that are most often employed today. The primary visual manifestation of this rhetoric, found both in public art and tourism promotion literature, is a set of ethnic personas, occupying a middle ground between racial stereotypes and mythic archetypes. These are popular cultural types like the iconography of saints before them, and they're recognizable to us through attributes of clothing and costume, arts and crafts, skin color and facial type, architecture, tools, and modes of transportation. When linked to assumptions about technological progress, occupational status, and above all, gender roles, these images also encapsulate and endorse a particular vision of social hierarchy. The interaction of political rhetoric with popular tourist imagery began as early as the 1870s, at a point when the Southwest was shifting from the military phase of colonization to the romantic phase that we still live in today. So for instance, at the 1876 Centennial Exposition at Philadelphia, the territory of New Mexico was asked to send exhibit materials, produce, minerals, and they also said, well, you have these interesting cultures, and so a delegate of Navajos went, Manuelita sitting in the middle with the hand-woven dress over her shoulder, for instance, is a famous historical figure. A blanket was woven for the occasion which said 1776 USA 1876. So a Navajo blanket went and was kind of a talisman of Southwestern culture. This was only slightly more than 10 years since the Navajo were still fighting with not only the U.S. Army, but for instance, the New Mexico Volunteers, a unit of Hispano volunteers during the Civil War headed by Major Jose D. Sena, who actually objected to this valorization of the Navajos. These are our enemies, why are you raising them up? So you can see it's a period when it's shifting from military colonialism to romantic colonialism. Once the railway arrived in New Mexico in 1880, you started to have some tourists filtering in. Cook's Tour started bringing some tourists in, and the territory started thinking, how could we cater to that? At the same time, New Mexico is a territory, and it's not being admitted as a state, whereas other western states that have smaller populations are being admitted. They're pretty much all Anglo-American. They're above suspicion, whereas the largely Hispanic Catholic population raises doubts for New Mexico. So it's at this time that the civic leaders and the business leaders start to think about how can we attract investment and how can we cast the population of New Mexico in terms that will be acceptable to the rest of the country. So they staged their own exposition in 1883, the Tercio Millennial Exposition, and if you can see the murals at the top of that at that gate, there are teepees, an Indian pueblo, and then signs of industry. So they're starting to work on a chronology of progress. They also had Indian dances. As the newspaper said, Oriental-looking Zuni Indians of the 16th century. And I wonder, how they got them. But the whole idea of, placing Native people in the past. They're in this romantic past. They're not of the present. That was followed by a de Vargas pageant, or reenactment of the Spanish reconquest of Santa Fe in 1692-93, and also a reenactment of the U.S. Army occupation by General Kearney. One of the leaders in forming that, Tercio Millennial, was the territorial secretary, the second in command in the state, appointed by the U.S. president, a person who went on to become the territorial governor, and that's L. Bradford Prince. So he spent the rest of his life here. He wrote a series of books. He led the campaign for statehood. And here he is applying the 19th century tropes of progress through historical periods and technology to the present. And so, as you can probably read better than I, he's talking about the Pueblo Indians as belonging to the past. He's associating, well, I actually have a little text here that might work here. He was familiar with the colonial rhetoric, and he really has it in place almost full blown at this point. A chronology of conquest and technology justifying social hierarchy, the consignment of Pueblo Indians to the past, the linking of contemporary Mexicans with Spanish conquistadors, and the association of Americans with military conquest, science, and capitalism. Now, in response to, it wasn't just that those in the East feared that Hispanic Catholics couldn't be counted on as loyal citizens. There was also propaganda about the mongrel New Mexicans. They're intermarrying, they're mixing out there, they're a degenerate race, you know, all the racial stereotypes. And so part of this rhetoric of triculturalism that Prince first articulates most clearly and then reigns for, you know, 125, 130 years, is that not only are these three groups, but they're not mixing, they're separate groups, when in fact they had already mixed to a significant degree in various ways. So this starts as a formulation of public rhetoric, and at the same time, there, you know, as you know, we saw in the Tercio Millennial pageants, and now in the popular press of the day, Frank Leslie's Harper's Weekly, imagery, you know, of the Southwest, of the Pueblos as they were, of the conquistadors and so forth, that start to develop a visual imagery to go with these ideas. It's a little bit fragmented at first, but then the Santa Fe Railway goes bankrupt in the early 1890s, and then they come back with a program of trying to attract more tourists to the Southwest, get more riders on the line. And they become a major focus for kind of generating imagery for the Southwest, generating artists' curios and so forth. And in fact, their major center for these activities is here in Albuquerque at the Alvarado Hotel, Freddie Harvey House Hotel. There's an Indian Arts building. North of Central, across from where the Alvarado Transit Center is now, there was an Indian village with the Pseudo Pueblo and Hogans in it, which you're seeing on the lower side. And native artisans and interpreters lived there. So, for example, Ellie and Tom of Ganado, that is from the Ganado area, where Lorenzo Hubbell's trading post had been a kind of center of Navajo weaving. And although they lived there for over 20 years as a couple, Ellie is the one who emerges in tourist imagery. She weaves a blanket, and I think it's 1904, a red, white, and blue blanket that's presented to Theodore Roosevelt when he is here. So then she enters the tourism iconography. She didn't have children of her own. She's almost always photographed with children, sometimes presented as hers. And it's a kind of first sense of Native Americans not only being put in the past, but being represented by women and children, with men often edited out of the imagery. So there's a kind of feminization of Native culture. The weaving that's going on is interacting with the tourist market. After the Civil War, with the availability of industrial dyes, many Navajos wove these so-called eye dazzler blankets with bright contrasting colors. But once Lorenzo Hubbell and then the Fred Harvey Company wants to start to sell weavings to a domestic market, to a market in the East. People who associate Native Americans with harmonious pastimes, they want an arts and crafts palette of earth tones. And so as you can see in the space of 20 years, there's this shift from eye dazzlers woven for the Navajos themselves to the translation of that into an arts and crafts home decorating motif. The Santa Fe Railroad supports the burgeoning Taos and Santa Fe art colonies by buying their paintings. They put out an annual calendar and distribute it to up to 300,000 depots, schools, and homes across their service area, which is basically Chicago, Kansas City, and all points to the southwest. The images they select are overwhelmingly Native Americans, secondarily, well, first Pueblo, then Navajo, then landscape, occasionally Hispanos or Santa Fe itself. And in the painting on the left, again, there's a pattern that's starting to develop. That's Rancho Sataos Church, which is a Spanish colonial settlement, of course, but we've got Taos Indians in front of it. And so there's a way in which the architecture, even of a Spanish village, gets attributed to Native Americans. And that's a kind of romanticism that continues today. The architecture on the UNM campus, and I'll have one image in a bit, draws equally on Spanish colonial and Pueblo architectural forms, but it's almost always spoken of as the Pueblo style. So the Hispanic contribution has been omitted from the story, and I would suggest that painting is an example of that. Other places where this imagery starts to develop, the World's Fairs. So for example, a Midway exhibit, the Cliff Dwellers at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, a kind of stage set Pueblo where pottery making and Indian dances were demonstrated. And among the demonstrators were Julian and Maria Martinez, who went to the fair on their honeymoon to be demonstrators and interpreters. And of course, they become famous as the foremost potters of their generation. Now, one of the things I'd like to trace here, as I've said, clothing is important to this, and it's the way in which individual native artisans became exemplars of the imagery that was developing, and they altered their everyday clothing in order to perform this image. And we're seeing it a little bit here. I would just, and I'll show a picture later of Julian in everyday work clothes, and I would just guess under that blanket that's what he has. And there are later examples when they're living at the Palace of the Governors that he would throw on a vest, he would throw a blanket over himself. Maria's clothing is a little bit more out of the norm. It's not the off the shoulder hand woven dress, but it's calicos, home sewn into forms that are more traditional. So she's kind of more acceptable in her everyday appearance. So the Santa Fe Railway, the World's Fairs, and to the extent that architecture is a component of this, for a time in the late aughts, the University of New Mexico is the center of defining the revival style, mixture of Spanish portals and terraced Pueblo forms. But it really takes the founding of the Museum of New Mexico in 1909 to have a civic cultural entity with a sustained program of pulling all these elements together, of wanting to revive the city's economy through tourism, wanting to foster not only an art colony but regional arts, and as a state institution wanting to help make sense of the cultures and the politics of New Mexico. So once Congress votes statehood for New Mexico in 1911, and it's to be enacted in January of 1912, there's a kind of welling up of pride. New Mexico's waited 64 years. It's seen all these less populated states or territories made states. And so on the 4th of July in 1911, and then they repeated in 1912, they have a grand parade, a grand procession. And they cast this history in historical terms. And this is that 19th century trope of progress through technology and transportation. So parades that linked advances in transportation to particular ethnic groups implicitly justified social hierarchy. Pueblo Indians on foot and horseback, Spanish colonists with horses and two-wheeled carts, followed by Santa Fe trail wagons, the U.S. cavalry, stagecoaches, a railway float, and then finally business leaders riding in recently arrived automobiles. So you can see the implicit progress of transportation and the way it's linked to ethnic groups. Santa Fe, of course, also embraces and advances the regional revival architectural style, first in a highly speculative restoration of the Palace of the Governors. You can see the territorial era portal on the top, and then the facade that we know today, which was the kind of their first statement of the Santa Fe style. The 1912 plan of the city was an attempt to revive the economy, and they basically said, we were bypassed by the main line of the railroad, we've been in terrible economic decline, and ill-conceived Americanization has robbed us of our attractiveness to the tourists who are filtering in. They're passing through, they're going immediately on to the Pueblos, on up to Mesa Verde. We need to remake the town in the Santa Fe style to attract and hold them. So this new institution, Museum of New Mexico, is already very active in economic development, cultural identity making. And they commissioned, there's not really an art colony in Santa Fe, so they commissioned a Denver artist to paint 3 murals. They've already done the 1911 and 12 4th of July processions, which are in these historical terms. Governor Prince is still on the scene, who had formulated tri-culturalism. And so the 3 murals are Native Americans in a kind of a primordial natural setting, the peaceful reconquest of Santa Fe in 1692, which we're seeing in the middle, and the third panel that you're not seeing is a Santa Fe wagon train cresting the hill about to descend into Santa Fe. So again, you can see the 3 cultures, the progress from one to another. Now, Julian and Maria Martinez again. Julian worked as a laborer at the Pajarito Plateau excavations that Edgar Hewitt started in 1907, even before the museum was founded. And you're seeing him there on the left, and he and the other Tewa workmen and the Hispanic workmen all wore, off-the-shelf workman's clothes, overalls, store-bought shirts. The Pueblo Indians had long hair, earrings in their ears. They were, distinguishable from the Hispanics. But because of that experience as a cultural intermediary and interpreter, he and Maria had already been at the St. Louis World's Fair. He's working on these excavations. When the museum is founded in 1909, he's employed as the janitor in the Palace of the Governors. And he and Maria and their kids move into quarters behind the palace. At those excavations, he's had a chance to study rock art, to see what the archaeologists are interested in, to see the pottery that's coming out of the excavations, the polychromatic pottery, and then he studies that, under the encouragement of Kenneth Chapman, expert on Pueblo pottery. He studies that at the museum. They also unearth some shards of black pottery, which is out of the ordinary and unusual. And Chapman encourages Julian to try to duplicate that. And he duplicates the black pottery by about 1914. And then after the First World War, he goes about developing a matte black paint and develops the black on black pottery style that would make him and Maria particularly famous. Maria was the potter. She knew what, where to find the clays, how to throw and fire the pots, and traditionally women had painted the pots historically. But at San Ildefonso Pueblo, an Indian school teacher encouraged some of the young boys to take up painting. And one of those, Crescencio Martinez, was kind of the best of the painters. He taught Julian to paint, and then he died Crescencio died in the 1918 influenza epidemic. But you can see here one of Julian's early paintings. One of the things he had observed in the rock art and in the pottery shards was a water serpent motif. And you can see that appears in his painting, and then by the time that he perfects the black on black pottery, he also brings in the water serpent motif. And this becomes a kind of signature of a new style of pottery, which makes Julian and Maria relatively wealthy. They move back to San Ildefonso Pueblo, they open a small shop there, they buy a Model T, and Julian paints it with black paint and paints the serpent on his Model T. What a magnificent modern gesture. So the museum's fostering, indigenous arts, and it also campaigns for and builds the Fine Arts Museum, which we all know, to attract artists from elsewhere. Really, kind of becomes a summer colony and then a transplant from Greenwich Village. And it's a building that mixes Spanish Pueblo forms with terraced Pueblo forms on the right. So again, I'm saying it's a hybrid, eclectic revival. And then in the mission form at the far upper left, of course, is based on it becomes the theater. And in the tradition of 19th century Beaux-Arts civic buildings, art is integrated in the building and becomes a statement and elaboration of the meaning of the institution. This series of murals starts with the conversion of St. Francis, St. Clair, I can't remember what, St. Clair is the one that's straight ahead. There's one that's not yet here, and it's Christopher Columbus leaving his son with the Franciscans in Spain before he goes off to the New World. Then there are Franciscans at Chichen Itza, which is a Mayan site that the museum's excavating. And finally, the Franciscans contemplating their plans for the New Mexico missions. So you can see how that kind of historical narrative is trying to wrap the institution in Catholic devotion and European antecedents. The 4th of July celebrations were kind of one-off. They did them for 2 years. Their energy shifted to working at the San Diego World's Fair in 1915 and 16. First World War intervenes. But then in 1919, they decide to revive the fiesta. They cast it as a historical fiesta, and it becomes a 3-day celebration in which each day is dedicated to one of the three peoples. So it's Pueblo first day, it's the coming of the Spanish conquistadors in the second day, and the enactment of General Kearny and the U.S. Army of the West conquering and occupying New Mexico on the third day. It's greatly successful, but it turns out that the Pueblo Indians aren't that happy about enacting the roles of a subjugated people, and it's hard to get them to participate. And very quickly, by the mid-1920s, the Indian market has spun off as a separate event, which is kind of locked off of the fiesta and becomes a separate event. And then the unsettling questions about alienated land grants that reenacting the coming of Kearny raises, and the fact that Anglo-Americans really don't want to celebrate their Anglo-ness. They want to fade into the background. They want to become part of the local authentic scene. The Kearny and the U.S. Army Day also by the mid-1920s is dropped. And in time, this fiesta, as you probably know, becomes a major, very substantial celebration of contemporary ethnic identity. Very powerful, for all the people who grew up in Santa Fe over the years. What I would call an invented tradition, but one that has become a true and resonant tradition. So then just a little bit about these three peoples and, what were their everyday clothes like? Who got turned into a tourist persona and what kind of clothing did they adopt in order to do that? Showing a little bit about Julian and Maria, and here, by the 1930s, Julian has a plains headdress and a buckskin outfit, and for special occasions he would don this, and of course Maria, but to their side, their son Popovi Da, who actually after Julian dies becomes Maria's collaborator, painter of pots. But there are later pictures of him with his mother and Vincent Price, and Popovi Da is wearing a modern tailored suit, every bit as dapper as Vincent Price. So he's a modern person and not as interested in enacting this persona. Or here, elite and working class Hispanos in New Mexico. Territorial Governor Miguel Otero Jr. In formal dress, or parishioners in the small village of El Cerrito in 1940. And you can see, store-bought or home-sewn clothing, very much what farmers and working class people across the country would wear in those days. There are not nearly as many Hispanic revival arts at this point. There is some wood carving. There is starting to be some weaving at Chimayo, of course. But few, if any, of the Hispanic artisans rise to the level of kind of public personality in the way that Maria did. And nevertheless, when the Santa Fe Railway Fred Harvey Indian detours swung into Cordova, they would like to have a senorita with, wearing a mantilla, to pose for photographs. But this was pretty limited. That kind of image making didn't get much traction, except in Santa Fe at the time of the fiesta. And both Hispanics and Anglos, kind of reveled in this ability to embrace ethnic clothing, costume, identity. Anglo-Americans took on a number of personas, but primarily the frontiersman, the homesteader, the pioneer, would be the clothing, which of course for women meant the kind of full constraining, full skirts and constraining corsets that predominated through much of the 19th century. Now, of course, in the modern world, authority came clothed in the business suit. It's a form of clothing developed by London tailors in the late 1700s. It's utilitarian, it's efficient, it connotes sobriety and authority, and any kind of business person, senator, anyone with power would have worn that. And the Anglo artists in the Santa Fe and Taos art colonies wore it with a little inflection. Sometimes they wore a scarf instead of a tie, would have a cowboy hat. And you can see, well, in both the group of Santa Fe artists and the contrast between a Taos painter, Irving Kaus, and his model, the contrast between a kind of constructed performance of native persona and the everyday kind of transparent authority of the business suit. Now, of course, women in mainstream society are going through major changes in these years. This is the early 1920s. Women have received the vote, they're entering the workforce for the first time, and there's a kind of reform movement in women's clothing to simplify things. Coco Chanel is probably the best known, to, in a sense, adapt some of the aspects of the business suit to women's clothing. But it's the first point at which women can wear pants, and it's mainly elite women in recreational and travel settings, and then just the kind of the flapper dresses aren't as full and constraining. And I mean, John Sloan's wonderful Knees and Aborigines. What a great social observation of contrasting them. The Harvey Company's Indian detours had women couriers. And as you can see, they're adopting a bit of the clothing of Elio Ganaldo, a velvet shirt, a turquoise jewelry, squash blossom necklace, concha belt, and so forth. So Anglo women are, from that point on, are really given more license to embrace regional clothing than men are. And well, the fiesta clothing, fiesta skirts of latter day, I guess I may have an image of that coming up. So, what I'm talking about is the political ideology of triculturalism, the way the identities of the different groups are represented visually, but then one side effect of this is that interior design and decoration with the Santa Fe or the Spanish Pueblo revival style becomes a way for people to embrace local culture through those arts that are symbolic accoutrements of the personas. So you have the adobe architecture, the corner fireplace, the built-in bench, the paintings from the art colony, Navajo blankets, Pueblo pots, Catholic, retablos, devotional art, and then the elaboration of California mission-style furniture into a New Mexico mission-style furniture with some details from Spanish colonial artwork turned into motifs, which we're seeing on the lower left. So, in part, I'm trying to suggest that the development of this ideology and of this symbolic constellation occurs at certain places, at certain times. The Tercio Millennial Exposition, the Alvarado Hotel, the University of New Mexico, Santa Fe becomes really the driving center for many years, working in combination with the Santa Fe Railway Advertising Department. And then kind of the center of gravity shifts back to the University of New Mexico in the mid-1930s. Murals are added to elaborate it in the same way that we already saw at the Palace of Governors and in the Fine Arts Museum. The budget for building the building had run out before they could commission the murals, so they ended up writing a grant to the Carnegie Foundation, which actually funded them. Taos artist Kenneth Adams ended up doing the murals and then staying on as a faculty member for about 20 years. And President Zimmerman, who wrote the grant approval, said that they wanted to do these murals to reflect the spirit of democracy by representing the cultures of the three races as socially equal. So, I mean, my title, The Myth of Santa Fe, and part of the myth is there's harmony among the groups. There's equality among the groups. And I think, myths are valuable in being aspirations, so I don't argue with those as aspirations. But of course, the degree of discrimination that was present at that time, the use of military force to institute for Spanish and then American colonial, governance, are kind of, are elided, are papered over in these new images. So I think it was a worthy New Deal progressive desire to reflect equality and harmony among the groups. In retrospect, as we're going to see, the social and gender hierarchies that I've been starting to sketch out, in retrospect, 20 years later, and currently today, are all too transparent. And so the titles that I've given below are just phrases that I took out of Zimmerman's Carnegie grant application, and you can read them better than I. Associating Native Americans with their arts, with agriculture, with their adobe architecture, but with Navajo weaving. There's an Apache basket and Pueblo pottery. And then, the advance in technology, industrial tools, a bucket, a plow, the contribution of adobe architecture, the casting of Hispanics as farmers and members of the working class. And, well, many of you know these, so these aren't going to be surprises, but, you know, the jump to not only Anglo-Americans associated with science, with electricity, with technology, with all the things that came with the Second Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. And there's an Aryanism to the Anglo-Americans that's you know, quite astounding. You know, the only person with eyes has blue eyes. All the Anglos have blonde hair, and there's kind of an kind of an antiseptic quality to the to the identification of the race. And then finally the panel showing three students shaking hands, representing the harmony among the groups. And of course, it's the Anglo in the middle and the only figure that has eyes. And it's kind of present in that way. So then, despite that desire to reflect the spirit of democracy by representing the cultures of all three races as socially equal, the murals convey racial and gender hierarchies in a whole variety of ways. All but one of the women, for instance, are kneeling or sitting. All but one of the men are standing. There are larger numbers of women in the first two panels than in the subsequent, more advanced panels. And Zimmerman and the artist Kenneth Adams deployed this sort of chronological, technological chronology that I've been talking about at the World's Fairs and the Santa Fe Fiestas, which implicitly justified racial hierarchy. Indians practiced pre-industrial handcrafts. Spanish Americans possess mass-produced tools available since 1800 or so, and Anglos contribute scientific instruments, electricity, germ theory, medicine, which emerged with the Second Industrial Revolution a century later. So that's characteristic of the focus on historical and cultural identity in the 20s and 30s, teens, 20s and 30s in New Mexico. And the New Deal of the 1930s with the turbulence of the Great Depression, the federal government really embraced history and culture as a way to reinforce social solidarity and cultural continuity. But this tri-culturalism continues in political rhetoric and in tourism promotional literature after the Second World War with very few elaborations. They're basically just reproducing a set of tropes. So for example, on that New Mexico magazine cover, we've got Maria Martinez with, I can't remember if it's a daughter, showing their pottery. We've got features on the Santa Fe Fiesta and the conquistadors in the magazine. We've got Anglo tourists, the woman in a regional dress, in a fiesta skirt with rickrack in place of a squash blossom necklace, and then the poor Anglo male confined even on vacation in a business suit. So this, by this point, this is a naturalized ideology. People repeat it, they take it for granted. The first, real challenge to it, of course, came from the Chicano movement of the 1960s and into the 1970s, which was a campaign, of course, for social justice, and in New Mexico it was a campaign for the return of stolen grant lands, but it's also a campaign for a different kind of consciousness, not of an identification with the conquistadors and Spanish purity as a way to counteract American racism, but a more realistic embrace of mestizaje, of the mestizo mixed native and Spanish ancestry of the Hispanic population. And again, not conquistadors, but modern day workers and even political activists with their power salutes. And of course, a kind of emblematic representation of this Chicano mestizo ideology is the kind of Janus-like figure with multiple faces representing the racial fusion of multiple groups. Now, given that that sensibility, that challenge to the previously accepted romantic and racist and sexist ideology, it's probably not surprising that the murals were, what word do I use here? You can read a bit of defaced, thank you. Yeah. In 1970, and then again in 1974, which we're seeing here. Now, the University of New Mexico, and there was another set of major protests in the early 1990s about these, and it's a topic of discussion again on campus. And the university has kind of said, well, this is a historical artifact, we need to keep it and learn from it. And as a historian, I'm in general in agreement with that. But the university said, we're going to recontextualize it, we're going to put up, some signage. The thing is, the signage, disappears, and and the kind of the controversy's forgotten. And so there needs to be, well, some people want to take them down, or there needs to be some other kind of permanent reconceptualization and kind of understanding and debate around these. So that's currently triggering that. That period, from the civil rights movements, enters academia, it enters the world of art, and so you have young artists of the Red Power and Chicano generation who question, the assumption that Chicanos are Spanish conquistadors. Well, no, they're lowriders. Miguel Gander shows us, or Harry Fonseca. Casts urban-dwelling Indians as coyotes, loose in the modern world. And so, that's a strong sensibility. Really on the surface in the 70s into the early 80s. It's still present, in people's scholarship and people's art. But the tri-culturalism, is strong, and it keeps being reasserted by the state and by the tourism industry here for the 75th anniversary of statehood. The Native American is in traditional dress. The Hispano has finally taken up the business suit of 1912, but the Anglo, is on vacation at the or this really breathtaking staged encapsulation of the rhetoric of tri-culturalism. And I hope that with what all I've been saying about the way ethnicity and gender, and in this case age, are used to give a hierarchy, of the Anglo who's kind of fading into the back, but he's the male adult, and then the Hispanic woman and the Pueblo child, set up a very clear assumption about social and gender hierarchy. And if that seems like I'm stretching things, try the thought experiment of switching it and putting a Pueblo woman in the back, a Hispanic man, and an Anglo boy in place of those figures. So you see, we kind of, we can take that as natural and just accept it, but you've really got to think about, and it's not, as you now know, this is not a one-off composition. It's many of the tropes that I've laid out that have been used over and over again. And so I think that, not only the civil rights movement, but a kind of irony and postmodern sensibility in art called into question constructions like the ideology of triculturalism that I'm talking about. Although a kind of fervent belief in traditional monuments asserted itself around the time of the quincentenary, the anniversary of Columbus coming to the New World. They're not putting up equestrian statues in Richmond, with Confederates on them anymore, but we have a generation of equestrian statues here, and even of, elaborate, ensembles. It must be 40 different pieces at the Albuquerque Museum, La Jornada, a Spanish, colonial procession coming up. One of the things about these is, this goes back to the conquistador identity, and it puts Hispanic identity in a historic period of contact when you can sustain a sense of Spanish purity. Now, of course, some of the Spanish colonists were already mestizo. They were children of the first generation in Spain. But it's a way to kind of reify contemporary Hispanic identity by focusing on this first contact in this colonial history. Now, of course, you probably know that the last conquistador, Oñate, who is in a visitor center just north of Espanola, had his foot cut off. Soon after he was installed, and one of the punishments that he meted out on rebellious Acoma Pueblo men, I think it wasn't I think it was maybe a couple of men that were from other pueblos. He had their foot chopped off, hence the blow torching or the welder, cut of taking that foot. Quickly replaced, but then a piece of art, which in its own way, questions, well, what is the result of the conquistador's blade? Bob Hausus, the Hickory Apache, very politically and culturally engaged historian. So there's a bit of a contest between traditional honorific forms of commemoration and of monument, and usually it's art. Sometimes it gets into public art that is more nuanced, more ironic, more questioning, more challenging. And to my mind, the greatest of the artists working this vein was Luis Jimenez, who had was a really great historian, really knew the history and found ways to, in a postmodern way, to double code his work, so that that's a monumental statue, but it has the kind of glossy commercial paints of a lowrider. And so it's making that tradition of monuments accessible to the public again. This is a sculpture, and I think he was doing 20 each of a series, and this was a really popular one. You can find it all across the American West. It's crossing the Rio Grande, so it's Mexican immigration to the United States, and I think, when he did the piece, it was wonderful. Today, it's even more, kind of right there to have that kind of a statement. Or his proposal for a monument, which ended up being an equestrian bronze of De Vargas and Santa Fe. And instead, he has De Vargas, standing with the plan, but it's a Pueblo Indian and a mestizo who are carrying the beam that's building the city. So it's not disrespectful, but it's a more realistic history. Okay, so you may well know this piece by Glenna Goodacre, installed in 1990, Sidewalk Society. And I think it recapitulates all of these long-established ethnic and gender personas to create a then contemporary diagram of tri-culturalism. Lacking skin pigment as a distinguishing feature, Goodacre adeptly deploys facial features and clothing to convey race and social class. In her idyllic world, an Indian single mother wears her traditional costume for the benefit of tourists while teaching her own daughter to perform the same role. Hispanics inhabit the working class and assume a posture of deference to Anglo authority. And Anglos are permitted a variety of modern roles, not only the customary businessman, but also the new professional woman, the carefree adolescent consumer, and a family on vacation. Now, you may remember that this occasion protests about casting Hispanics only in a laborer role, and also criticisms for the lack of an African American here. Surely one of the key criticisms of triculturalism, and the reason that it seems to be breaking down as an accepted ideology, is that it leaves so many people out of the equation. Not just African and Asian Americans, but also Hispanics from outside New Mexico and those of mixed ancestry. But as far as I've been able to determine, nobody at the time objected to the representation of Pueblo culture by casting a Pueblo woman and child in their customary role as objects of the tourist gaze. So, we're a society here in New Mexico that thinks in historical and cultural terms. We think about it, we talk about it, we build our buildings to look like they're historical. We have this whole sequence of sculptures and murals and public arts to try to express this. And we have a relatively new center for the generation of cultural identity here at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. And if the murals in Zimmerman Library were the apotheosis of tri-culturalism, I think the murals here in the Torreon are the apotheosis of Chicano mestizaje identity. And it's not just a single mestizaje, it's worlds of mestizaje. The staff here worked with Federico Vito, is that the painter? And four historians, Enrique La Madrid, Robert Torres, Robert Hemrick, and Adrian Bustamante. And so these are, very distinguished historians. I'm sure you've been in there, if you've studied it, it's incredibly rich in all of the stories that it's telling, the everyday people, the known historical figures. I mean, just unimaginable set of strands that come together and build, to figures holding up, young children, babies, towards the oculus, where there are symbols of the cosmos. And I think of it as being a kind of, a most elaborate elaboration of the La Raza Cosmica, the Vasconcelos idea of the Mexican people being a mestizo people, the result of the Spanish native interaction. And this is a working out of that identity with great historical accuracy in specifically New Mexican terms. The one thing I would say about it is it certainly places Hispanos in the modern American society as soldiers, as people involved in the professions, in justice, in education. I would just say, though, that Arthur Campa, the great linguist and folklorist, observed years ago that what distinguishes New Mexico Hispano culture from the cultures in Mexico is not that it's more Spanish, which was the claim of all these conquistadors. It's greater and more direct contact with American culture. And and so I'm not at all quibbling with this, but that's a harder thing when you're talking about an ethnic group identity, to be able to grapple with the way in which we're casting each other as in opposition to each other in these ethnic terms that the government keeps asking us to self-identify, and yet we're all modern citizens living together. So, my hat is really off to everybody who worked on this. To what extent is this ideology, this myth of triculturalism, still pertinent and being used today? And I'm sure you have your own sense of that. Mine is that it's less important than it was even 10 or 15 years ago. I find, when I search the internet, that it still appears, but primarily in travel writing and in tourism promotion. The Santa Fe Chamber of Commerce, is still using this, and travel writers coming in from the outside are still using it. But I think it's much less active in civic and political rhetoric than it was a generation ago. Diversity initiatives in employment and education and significant globalized migration and travel make it simply less believable to assert that New Mexico is made up of only 3 cultures and that they're separate cultures. I already mentioned some of the groups that are excluded from that formulation. But to the extent that we still think in historical and cultural terms, and that we continue to create public art and monuments, or that we debate what to do about the Zimmerman murals, I hope that this talk this afternoon has provided some useful context for that debate. Thanks.
Questions?
Yeah, questions or comments?
I have a comment.
Okay, no.
Who's first?
You go first. And then we'll
Okay,
go
thank you. So, the painting at the Zimmerman Library up there, One of the big things that was left out in the Hispanic painting of the Hispanics was the political person. Hispanics have always been almost the majority of the politicians at the State House, even before, you know, and of course they were always so during the colonial days and the Mexican period. But there was recently how far back it goes, the city council, for example, there was a recent archive dug up in somewhere in Mexico about the second settlement in New Mexico near San Juan Pueblo, where they dug up notes of the cabildo, then the city council meeting. So that was a big mistake they made by not adding the politicians in Hispanic New Mexico.
That's an extremely important point.
Sure it is.
And that kind of politics is one of the reasons that there is some substance to the harmony among the groups. You know, Hispanics had enough political power that they couldn't be treated the way blacks in the South were. You know, you can make a comparison between the politics of New Mexico and Arizona, where you actually have a diaspora of Confederates in the late 1860s. And the politics there is much more, racialized discrimination historically. Here, you're quite right. Hispanos have had political power. You know, it was unthinkable. There had to be alliances. And, you know, with the advent of tribal gaming, Native Americans have increasing economic and political power. So it's, it's even increasingly an even more balanced political scene, and I think that, cultural as well.
It was a very similar question. You present this tri-culturalism as a myth. Most of the evidence that you present seems to be primarily evidence that there's implicit racism built into and conflict between the groups built into the iconography.
Yeah.
Okay. But in terms of the actual relationships between the groups and explicit discrimination, etc., it's always seemed to me, having grown up primarily in Houston in the 50s, that there was much less of that kind of exclusion of Hispanics and more so with Native Americans.
Yeah, and I was in part, trying to suggest that. I think there's less overt expressions of racism and toleration of that. But then when you think about, say, that New Deal program and those murals, at the same time that was going on, Native arts were being emphasized in BIA schools, and the attempt to revive Native Hispanic arts and manual arts were emphasized in Hispanic schools, and science and math and a full liberal arts curriculum were emphasized in the Anglo schools, so that the symbolism was being enacted and reproduced through the educational system, and that's where surfacing and being aware of and challenging these stereotypes and thinking about how it connects to the way that society actually operates and reproduces itself. Yeah, next question.
I just wanted to add about the politicians and politics. The tribal people weren't even allowed to vote until the middle 1940 something. So 47, yeah. So that also affects the balance of things. I mean, they could go to war, they could do all kinds of other things, but not vote.
They couldn't vote. Not only that, but they couldn't buy alcohol on the open market.
Yeah, great. Question here and then at the door.
You know, I really appreciate the talk. I've been here 4.5 years, and I'm trying to figure out how you all deal with this stuff. And so let me ask one specific thing that I've noticed. A couple of things. I still hear the Spanish part and the resistance to the idea that Hispanics, depending within the whole hemisphere, are mestizo to some degree. In some places like where I'm from, New York, Puerto Ricans, probably 95% mestizo. Very few blancos left of the Puerto Rican culture. The second thing is, which I found controversial here, which I was surprised at, which is not controversial where I come from, is that the U.S. Army took this area because it could. That is controversial here. I have met people, Anglos, who say that's not true. I don't think you could find, it was a controversial war at the time. Abe Lincoln was opposed to it, as well other Whigs and other people. That's right. So in New York at this time, if I would say that comment, it would be non-controversial. There are a lot of things to be controversial in New York City about, but that wouldn't be it.
Yeah.
But here it's controversial.
It is, and I think it's because there was a large settled population. The area of the Southwest that was annexed, the Mexican citizens, there were about 100,000 Mexican citizens in that territory. 80,000 of those were in New Mexico. Santa Fe was 7,000 people, Los Angeles was 1,000. So there was a settled population, and so the loss of the common lands in particular, is remembered because of the way that it undermined the villages. So it was not just, whether or not you think that the United States picked the U.S.-Mexican War, or was justified, or, whatever the outcome was. It's the way that land grants were adjudicated after the Anglos were in power, and there's a whole very extensive, well-researched literature on land grant history that shows the many mechanisms that were used to say, okay, well, that's common land, you're sharing it in that way, but this is a new capitalistic society, everything needs to be private property or belong to the government. We're taking your common lands, and now the Forest Service is going to
Better said, to steal the lands.
Yeah. Good. And then at the door.
Buenas tardes todos, yo soy Daniel Antonio Herrera y yo era un residente de la Merced del pueblo de la Merced de Manzano. I'm one of those presidents of one of those organizations that you were speaking of, one of the land grants. Speaking for Manzano, we were a vibrant community all the way up until the 1970s when the Forest Department, BLM, they stole our land. They stole it, they stole it, they stole it. Because of that, so many of us had to go to Albuquerque or Las Vegas or wherever there was a city, even California, even New York, there was a diaspora of our own because they stole our land. We were no longer a viable agricultural society. That's it. If you're wondering why New Mexico is so poor and we do so horribly on the standardized tests, that's why. From the very beginning, we should have been the senators, the governors, us, and the Native American people. And by the way, we're all related, especially now that we're doing genetic testing. And I can only speak from my side of the mountains, in this Manzano, Torreon, Tejique. We're finding out now that we're 30%, 28%, 38% Native American. Luckily, in my community, we know where we come from. Our people were originally Chianende and Mescalero Apaches. They were there before the Spanish came in. We know who we are. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we're owed all of those benefits that should have been ours to begin with? 30% Native American? What does that mean? Can we do casinos? All I'm saying is our history is a lot more amazing and rich than many people understand.
Wonderful comment, kind of elaboration of what the murals talk about and really lay out, and there could be 1,000 different stories, that elaborate and enrich what's already in those murals.
So I have a question. When do you want to have that discussion on taking that down or changing it?
Okay, so the provost and associate provost have appointed a committee of faculty, staff, and students to study this, to work towards some options. There's going to be a class for students to take taught by Dean Kimberly Pinder, sitting over here in the spring, to have guest speakers, to have readings, to talk about questions of political art to come up with proposals. So there's a process to do some very serious discussion, consideration. Now, Kim, do you want to say a little bit about it, or is that enough to let people know that that's going on?
I mean, I am a mural historian, and I have been teaching a class that I've taught a number of years that has students come up with groups and they do proposals for murals. Sometimes they're just theoretical murals, other times, like right now, they're actually came up with a mural that they're now painting at the Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless. And so they go through the whole process of working together, having to go in front of their client or committee. And so we're using that model in the spring to come up with a series of proposals that will then be presented to the president, the provost, and the Board of Regents, and also to the community. And I'm glad you've given me a chance to speak, because we're designing the class. For instance, Professor Wilson will be speaking as a series of lectures about all of the many issues that are, as you can see just from this one lecture, that are inherent in the complexity of the murals that come up with them, and they will be open to the public. So look for that as kind of a lecture series all around the issues in the Zimmerman murals.
Yeah, Michael?
Well, and I want to mention, this relates to us as well. And in terms of those meetings, there's been a tremendous amount of activism since, as has already been referenced, in the 1970s and well as the 1990s. And there are many people in our community who were engaged in the 70s as well as the 90s. And
They'll
we
be
have been
speaking in my class.
Right. Yeah, and they will. But what I wanted to bring up for this is we are talking about doing one of these Canoa lectures that will be devoted, and we'll have a panel specifically on this subject. So that there's going to be a lot of opportunity to engage in a discussion on this.
Maybe one last question. You spoke before. You haven't spoken.
Yeah, it's my understanding that Jimenez sculpture that's at Martinez town,
Yes.
which is a myth, a Mexican myth. It was originally destined for Tigway Park, but it was turned back by efforts.
Yeah, the old town neighborhood.
Yeah.
Didn't want it.
What do you make of all of that?
Oh, that also happened when the, what was it, Daughters of the American Revolution had Madonna of the Trails sculptures that they were trying to place in each of the states. And they offered it to Santa Fe. It was an Anglo pioneer woman, and Santa Fe said, no, we don't want that. And Clyde Tingley, the then mayor down here, said, well, we'll take it. And so it's over there by the federal courthouse now. I think that's bound up with the question of Mexican versus Spanish or Spanish American identity. And I think there was a stronger Spanish American identity in Old Town, and at least my memory is, it didn't resonate with them, whereas Frank Martinez and other community leaders in Martinez Town, it resonated with them, and so they took it. I could get into it, but it's very, those questions of identity and how even that terminology evolved, are as complicated as the ones I've given you here. Well, thanks again.
Just as a reminder, if you haven't been to Torreon, it's up until 5.
Yeah. Okay, thanks again for coming.